Today we're going to talk about the kind of mistakes that beginners often make when they're going to draw something for the first time. The example I'm going to take today is a picture of a mug. Everybody knows what a mug looks like, and I'm going to show you the way that I often see beginners drawing them. So the first thing they'll do is they'll go in with a line. They may or may not do some kind of ellipse at the top. Then they'll do another line, and they'll do the flat bottom on the mug, and then they will draw in a handle. And then hopefully also get the other side of the handle. That is a very basic beginner picture of a mug. Now, there's lots of things wrong with this. You can tell it's not great, but can you tell why it's not great? Well, firstly, yes, we have straight lines down the edges, but they're not quite parallel. So that's the first thing we'd need to tidy up. Secondly, the ellipse here is not the same shape on this end to this end. Thirdly, the handle isn't of consistent width. So there's quite a few things wrong there. The biggest thing that's wrong is the base of the mug. Because if we have an ellipse at the top, it means we are looking down on the mug slightly, in which case there will also be an ellipse on the bottom. Now, this is where your brain gets in the way. Your brain tells you that the base of the mug is flat. Of course it's flat. It would fall over if it wasn't. But when you look at your object, you will see that the base has an ellipse, and actually the bottom ellipse is deeper than the top one because you're looking even further into the ellipse at the bottom. You're in a higher position in relation to this than you are to this. So if you can imagine you were right over the top of the mug, you'd actually see a circle. So the higher up you are in relation to the mug, the bigger and wider that ellipse is going to be. So the bottom ellipse is wider than the top ellipse. Now when I say width, I'm on about this here. So let me show you how I would draw a mug the proper way. The first thing I would do is get myself a reference picture. Something like the mug, you could actually just get an actual mug from the kitchen, but it's often easier, especially for beginners, to draw from photographs because it takes one of the variables out, and that variable being your position in relation to the mug. So let's just go off a photograph to start with. Every photograph I use in this will be available to you to download afterwards. So if you want to have a go at doing exactly the same thing, taking on board the tips that I've given you, then you've got all the reference that you need. So we're looking at our mug. The first thing I'm going to do is look at the width versus the height, and then put some little marks on my blank page just for me to mark out where on the page it's going to go. So the first thing I'm going to do is just use my pencil, and I'm going to look at the height of the mug. I'm putting the back of the pencil just on the bottom bit, and then I'm just going to take a mark there where my fingers are gripping just where the top came to. And then I'm going to turn it sideways and look at the width of it compared to, without moving my fingers, look at the width of it compared to the height. This mug is wider than it is tall. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark out roughly where I want it to go on my page. Just with a very light line, I'm going to say I want the top to be there and I want the bottom to be here. I look at that and I make sure that I've actually got enough width there for the mug to fit on. So I'm going to say I want the side to be here and the handle be over there somewhere. We don't know quite where yet, but we know that it's going to be wider than it is tall. So I've made those marks wider than that. Now the next thing I'm going to do is look at the shape of the top. So I am just looking at roughly the shape of that curve, and look how lightly I'm sketching this. On the camera, I bet you can hardly see it, but it is there. I'm just looking at that and thinking, it's about that much. Again, it doesn't matter if it's not quite right. Now after that, I'm looking at this and thinking, it's too far that way. Because if I do the sides coming down here now, I'm not going to have space for my handle. So I'm going to redraw that, but this time a little bit over that way. That's where I want the actual top ellipse of the mug to be. Very sketchy, just tickling the pencil on the page, not putting any pressure, I'm not indenting into the page at all. Just dusting that graphite onto the page. Now from there, I can come down, making sure that my edge is nice and straight. And then I'm going to do the same thing off this side of the ellipse. Come down. We don't quite know how far at the moment, but that's fine. We're just going to put that edge in very lightly. Next thing I'm going to do is look at the shape of the bottom. Now we know that the bottom of the mug is flat. Logically it has to be, but it doesn't appear flat on here. It curves down, it carries on curving very, very slightly, and then it curves up again more sharply on the edge. So we have to do two things here. We have to make sure we get this very slight graduation across the bottom, and we have to make sure that this curve is a perfect match for that curve, because otherwise our mug will not look neat. The other thing we're going to do is this curve is going to be slightly more curved than the top one. So that's the shape of our top one. So our bottom one is going to go roughly the same, maybe just a little bit more curved. And then as it comes up towards the edge, we get quite this steep corner. Then I'm going to come back over here and do the other steep corner. Now I might adjust it a little bit because it doesn't look quite equal one side to the other. Don't be afraid to put down quite a few marks. Some of them will be right, some of them you'll rub out in a minute. So that's more or less there. Just make sure that that is looking straight. Okay, and I'm happy with that. I can see that if I now measure this again, if I want to measure that what I've assessed there to be the height of the mug is right in proportion to the width, I can use my pencil again and I can say, right, the width of the top ellipse, top of the mug is that. How high is it in relation? It's almost exactly the same, actually. In this instance, the top, that length there, and this width here are pretty much identical. It's very awkward to show you on the camera, but I hope you can see that. So now I can check on my mug. Have I got it the right height? Got it there. If I turn it that way, yeah, that's pretty close. I'm happy with that. One thing I'm not happy with is I think my curve at the top is a little too high. I'm just going to flatten that edge of the ellipse off a little bit there. So just say, even with someone who's a professional artist, you don't get your drawing right first time. It's unrealistic to expect to be able to go in with a hard line straight away and just get it right. We all have to go through this sketchy stage where we're just feeling our way and trying to find where we want our actual lines to go. So I'm happy with that now. I'm looking at, no, actually, I'm not happy with it. The one thing I've just noticed is that this mug is not completely upright on the edges. It slopes in slightly. So that's why mine's not looking quite right. So let's just fix that. Let's bring these lines in just a tad into a narrow gradient. And the same on this side. And then bring it off to a gradient like that. Okay, that's better. Now I'm feeling closer. Before I go any further at this stage, I'm going to rub out the lines that I don't want because they're going to be confusing me. So again, using my rubber quite lightly, I do not need to press hard on this because the lines I put on were very delicate and hesitant. I'm also going to get rid of that ellipse at the top that we don't want. Get rid of that edge that was too steep. Okay, and then just move that down there. So yeah, now I'm happy that the shape of my mug is pretty close to my photograph. So what am I going to do next? I'm going to look at this handle. And I'm going to look at the basic size of it and say, how big is it roughly in relation to the rest of the mug? So I can see it starts round about here, just a little way down the edge. I just put a little mark there. And here it starts just after the curve, and just as it starts to get straight on the edge is where the bottom of the handle comes to. And then if I look at the width of the mug at that point and compare that to the width of the handle, it's less than half of the width of the mug. So the width of my mug is about there on mine, a little bit bigger than the drawing. And the width is less than a half, so maybe about here is where it comes out to. And then looking at this shape here, it does not come out straight at the top, it curves up slightly. So we're going to give a slight upwards curve. And I'm just going to worry about this outer line to start with. This bit is straight, and it comes up more or less at a 45-degree angle. So I'm just going to sketch that bit in. So I've got the top and the bottom of the handle. Now, I've got to join those up with a nice curve. Look at what looks different on mine. What looks different on mine to this one? This is more curved. Mine's gone flat there. So let's just bring that out a little bit so it's more of a round it off a bit. Right, now the other thing I'm going to do is the inside part of that. So I'm just going to eyeball roughly how wide I think that is. Make sure this bit is the same width, and then I'm going to put a couple of little markers in here that keep that width consistent, because this is a very evenly spaced handle. It doesn't go fat and then thin like some do. So I just join the dots. So what looks different about mine to that one? It still doesn't look quite right. I think I need to bring this out into more of a curve at this point. If you can hear tip-tapping in the background, it's because the dog's decided to join me. Somebody wants a dinner. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. I'm thinking this space in between looks bigger on there than it does on mine. So maybe make that handle just a little thinner, just to create that space to be a little bit bigger, the bit where your fingers go when you pick the mug up. And then gently just rub out that line that I don't want. So we're already getting closer here, but I'm looking at it and thinking it's still not quite right. What's not right? And I think the difference is that this slope on the edge is more pronounced than the way that I've drawn it. So if I go any further, I'm just going to bring that in just a little steeper again on both sides. Is that right? Now the mug is starting to look too narrow. So maybe what I actually need to do is not bring it in at the bottom, I need to take it out more at the top. So let's just get rid of what I just did there. And this is the process of drawing. You will not get it right the first time, and that's why you need to use this light sketchy technique. So bringing it out a little bit at the top. Widening that ellipse. Making sure that our ellipse on the end does not have a pointy corner. It has to be rounded. But taking it out to that new point there. Okay, let's get rid of what we don't want so that we're not confusing ourselves. Okay, yes, that's starting to look more like the shape of a mug. Now, the other thing I need to draw in at this point is I need to look at this lip here, because you have the width of the actual ceramic that the mug is made out of. You need to try and capture that so it looks like it's not just a line. As it happens, I've already started to do it slightly there. I've got this in a circle. And even though I've drawn this line across here, in reality, you can hardly see any difference. That line across there is virtually invisible on the mug. You've got white here and white there, and very little differentiation in between. So if I want to bring that across, then most of this I can actually rub out. Now, as you can see, it's difficult to get into these tiny corners with a standard eraser. This is where one of these can come in handy. This is a Derwent pencil eraser. Now, I've sharpened this in my Super Duper pencil sharpener, so it's got a ridiculously long tip on it. But with this, you can get into the corners and you can rub out quite accurately. So it is very useful. I need to actually break that off because it's stupidly long. Let me get that some more sensible length. Now I've actually got a bit of control without it wobbling about everywhere. Get rid of this line here because we're going white to white. There, you can kind of see a slight line on the picture. Let's just rub it out a bit. Okay, so now we're getting something that looks fairly much like the mug that we've got on the picture. So let's compare it to the amateur drawing that we did earlier. Already that's looking an awful lot better, but there's more we can do. If you were going to use this as the basis for a painting, this is probably as much as you'd need to do at this stage. But in terms of practicing the drawing skills, I'm just going to take it that one stage further. I'm going to look at the shading and the lights and darks on my picture. I look at where is my lightest bit, and there's white here, there's white in there, and where are my darkest bits? Well, under this lip, under the base, it goes very, very dark, almost black at that point. Then we've got a bit of a shadow, and then there's a bit more of a shadow. We can see that there's darkish section around here, a little bit round the bottom, which helps you give the idea of the fact that the mug is curving in. And we've got this dark section here. The only bit of it that's really dark is this line underneath. So we want to capture that bit. All my sketching so far has been done with a 6H pencil. It's only a cheap one, but that's one of the hardest ones that you can get. And I like that because I don't want to make dark, heavy lines when I'm at the sketching stage. So that's one of the few times that you really use the H pencils. But in order to come in here and put my dark shadows in, I'm going to use an 8B. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you've got a 2B, a 4B, a 7B. The fact is, it's going to be reasonably dark, and it'll allow you to get a dark line on your paper. So what I'm going to do is look at where the darkest point is on this, which is this line that comes underneath here, and I'm going to capture that. Now, whenever you're doing a curve, what you don't want to do is curve like this, because that doesn't feel natural. What I would do at this stage is actually turn my paper, and with my wrist on the page, I let the back of my hand become like a compass, so it can keep a nice steady line in that direction. It's very difficult to get the control making a U shape, but it's much easier if you're doing a curve that goes in a way that allows your hand to just rotate on the paper like that. So I'm just going to put in this dark edge. It doesn't come all the way across as dark, but it gets a little finer and lighter in that direction. Now let's turn it back up, the same orientation as my mug, and just compare it. As it comes up here, it gets lighter. So I'm going to feather it out just by tickling the pencil on the page at that point. So it's getting lighter as it goes up there. And then we've got this shadowy section that comes out. See, there's no pressure being put on here. I'm really letting the pencil do the work. And that disappears in that direction. Yeah, it does go up in a curve like that. A little darker in here, maybe. And this is almost like a little semicircle. So I can sketch that in. And because I'm not applying too much pressure, it means that I'm not getting any heavy scribbly lines in here. I'm literally allowing the pencil to do its job of laying the graphite onto the paper. And then we've got another shadow that comes out like this. Now, I'm not going to fit all of that on my page, and I don't really, not bothered about it at this point. But this also goes up in a slight curve, something like that. And what I can do then is I can take my pencil. These ones have super long tips on them because I use my super duper pencil sharpener. Now I need to stop at that point and think, about how far do I take that? Well, looking at my picture, it comes up to about there. So I'm just going to, again, just laying it on the side. And it's kind of flattish at that point. It goes flat out and then curves down. So I've got that there. And I'm just going to soften this edge here. So that's more or less where our shadow goes. What's really important at this point is to make sure that that shadow doesn't have any hard edges on it. Because as you can see on this, it's very, very soft on the edges. A little darker in the middle maybe, so we can just use the edge of the pencil just to apply a little bit more graphite, just to darken the shadow there. Again, no pressure being applied. I'm literally just tickling the surface with the pencil. Am I happy with that? Now this bit looks like it needs to go a little darker. So I'm using the tip again for that because I want a little bit more control. Because that's quite a distinct, it's got quite a distinct edge on that area. Okay, I'm happy with that. That's fine for a minute. Where else do I need to put some shading? The first thing I see is this bit that comes down the side of the mug here. So this whole section needs to be shaded, but there's a highlight here. And I don't want to lose that because it's pretty much the only highlight on the whole of the mug in this picture. Normally you'd see a few more, but because of the way this is being very brightly lit on the photograph, that's the only highlight on the whole thing. So if I look at this, I've got it's wider here and narrower there. Can you see this, like that little dark bit? So I'm just going to put in that kind of edge, just use the tip a little more. And then there's the white highlight gap, which is only very thin. And that comes down to just before where the shadow starts. Okay. And then it comes out gradually. That comes out here and it gets lighter and lighter as it comes in this direction. So I'm back to the side of my pencil again. And I'm just going back and forward very lightly, bringing it out, getting lighter and lighter, just that, to the point that here I'm barely touching the page at all. Here I'm resting, pressing on it, I'm just resting on it a little bit heavier. So that's brought us out in that direction. A little bit further maybe. And then just darkening the shadows towards the edge. And then when we look up here, we can see where I talked earlier about the lip of the mug. We've actually got an edge here, comes up to that edge. I'm still using the side, I'm just doing very small marks. You could also go in that direction as well. And don't panic if you get it wrong at this stage, because if you're applying it light enough, it's going to be very easy to rub things out. Okay, so I need to just level this out here, just a tad, make that there. And then we've got you can barely see it probably on the camera, but even on the photograph, I can barely see that there's a very slight shadow that comes across the base of the mug here. So again, turning my hand, so my hand can be used as a compass and work with the curve. Kind of comes up there. That's it. And what you can do at this point is you can use your finger. If you want to soften this, because we're using a soft pencil, you can actually blend that out with your finger to give you a super, super soft edge. The other thing you can do is if you decided you haven't left quite enough space for the highlight, you can come back in and rub it out, because we've gone in super light. Happy with that bit? Across here, it's virtually pure white, which is unusual, but that's because, as I said, this photograph is very brightly lit. So we don't need to worry about doing anything in here, keeping it really simple. The other bit where there's a shadow is on this lip here. It's very slightly grayer there. So again, I'm going to come in and just put a little grey in that bit of the lip of the curve. And then obviously on this side, we've got quite a strong shadow on that inner part here, whereas the inner part here is very light. Over here, it's really quite dark. So in we come, just getting that edge crisp. Again, no pressure, no solid outlines. And as it comes out in this direction, it fades to nothing. Tickling it on there. Taking your shade in that little bit lighter as it goes towards the middle. Barely touching the paper at this point. And as it comes in here, we want to just keep that edge fairly well defined. So we're going back to the tip of the pencil. Okay. Now, because today we're not going to be trying to do all the background on this, I am just going to put in just a hint of a line at that point, just so that we have a definite stopping point for the mug. But if you were doing this as a painting and it was going to be against a white background, you're allowed to leave that empty. It's what they would call a lost edge. Not everything needs to be cleanly defined. And here we're going to have a lost edge on the mug, because this is white and this is white and there's very little differentiation in between. We're not going to put anything across there, because the shading that we've put in is enough to tell you that is the inner part of the mug. You don't need to make it any more complicated than that. Again, we can use our finger just to soften it if we want. And I'm not going to be too fussy about this, because this is an exercise in learning how to draw in order to paint. This is not a drawing lesson as such. Kind of is, but the other bit I'm going to do is there's a slight shadow just inside the handle of the mug there. So again, I'm just going to put that in, just going in with the side of the pencil. We want a crisp edge on it at that point, but in this direction it just fades out. We can use our finger just to smudge that a little bit. Normally I'd expect to see a shadow maybe down here on the underside of the handle, but in this example there really isn't one, so we're going to go with what we see. So I could do more. I could put in backgrounds and all sorts of stuff, and there's a slight shadow here I could maybe put in, but for now that's enough. So let's compare that back to the beginner drawing. And as you can see, it's night and day. Because what we've done this time, yes, there's been a little bit of learning about how to apply the pencil and how much pressure to put on there and so on. But the big difference is, A, we had a reference picture. B, we spent a lot of time looking at the reference picture to establish the proportions, looking at the shapes, and looking at the values in terms of light and dark. And if you can get the proportion, the shape, and the value right, your drawing will be so much better. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it helpful. If you need to, watch it again as many times as you want. You can hit pause, you can hit rewind, allow yourself to just work at your own pace until you get where you need to be. Rinse and repeat. If you need to do it more than once, do it more than once, because you will get there if you keep practicing. And then I'll see you in video 2 coming up very soon, which is the teapot.